I'm Dawn Nagy, the Director of Alumni Relations for the Crummer School, and I am thrilled that you are here for our Crummer Alumni Weekend and 60th Anniversary Celebration. This is a series of events over the course of 2 days, so hopefully I've seen many familiar faces. A lot of you have been to other events. We may have people continuing to trickle in from our faculty brunch. So I just wanted to remind everyone this event is being live streamed. So we welcome our alumni audience online who are not able to be here in Central Florida today. We are ready for our panel. I am thrilled that I work with such a great group of colleagues who, when I say, will you participate in a panel during a Saturday on Alumni Weekend, they all say, absolutely, of course. And I think that's a testament to them and a testament to all of you, because it's your commitment to the school and their commitment to the school that makes the Alumni Association and the Crummer School so great. So we originally had 4 panelists today. Dr. Mary Conway Dato-on is ill and is traveling with students internationally next week, so we wanted her to rest up. One other faculty member has flown in on a flight this morning. Another one is probably going to be ill, so we really appreciate all of their commitment to being here today. This discussion is called Globalization and Its Discontents, a discussion of some of globalization's grand rewards, unrealized promises, and unintended consequences. And with us today, I will have them introduce themselves, but I wanted to introduce our faculty panelist and moderator, Dr. Keenan Yoho. He is Associate Professor of Operations Management. He has just started with the Crummer School. He's been here about 18 months now, and so he is going to moderate our panel today. So I'm going to invite Dr. Yoho to go ahead and get us started.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. And thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon. So the title of our panel today is Globalization and Its Discontents, and I'd first like to introduce our panelist. Dr. Bill Seyfried is a professor of economics here at the Crummer School. His expertise is in the area of macroeconomics, including the Fed and monetary policy, as well as the interaction of the financial system and the economy. Dr. Seyfried currently serves on the Economics Council of the Florida Chamber Foundation. He's regularly quoted in numerous publications, including the Financial Times, Forbes.com, MSNBC.com, CNN Money, the blog of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Orlando Sentinel, Orlando Business Journal. Where have you not been quoted?
And the Crummer Alumni Newsletter.
And the Crummer Alumni Newsletter. And then here on my right, to your left as you're looking, is Dr. Keith Whittingham. He's an associate professor of management science here at the Crummer School. He teaches elective courses and leads consulting projects in global sustainability and social entrepreneurship. He teaches the core course on quantitative business analysis. His research interests are largely in sustainable enterprise development and process improvement. He's the founder of the college's Social Entrepreneurship and Sustainability Initiative. He frequently travels internationally, including just moments ago. With students on sustainability projects. And prior to joining Crummer, Keith had held senior management positions in manufacturing, research, and development at Bell Laboratories and Lucent Technologies. So those are our panelists today, and Dawn's already introduced me. I'm fairly new to Crummer, and I teach in the operations area, and also I teach data analysis along with Keith. So it was just 87 years ago that Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud was published. And in Germany, it was published under the title Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, or the literal translation, the uneasiness in civilization. And at that time, this was quite an extraordinary book, and it remains so today. It's kind of considered part of the Western canon. It's still very, very formative and I guess one of the more important and in some ways controversial texts in psychology. We come upon a contention which is so astonishing that we must dwell upon it. This contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. How has it happened that so many people have come to take up this strange attitude or hostility to civilization? I believe that the basis of it was a deep and long-standing dissatisfaction with the then existing state of civilization, and that on that basis, a condemnation of it was built upon. occasioned by certain specific historical events. So those are excerpts from 87 years ago. And if we just replace the word civilization there with globalization, I think that it has some currency. So today, whereas Freud critiqued civilization itself, today we're going to have a brief discussion addressing several aspects of globalization. The economic myths and realities of globalization, which Dr. Seyfried will address, the intersection between globalization and sustainability, which Dr. Whittingham will touch upon, and some of the benefits and challenges of this interconnection, and the effect of markets on people and their social ties, as well as businesses where they work and buy goods. So our treatment of this will be far from complete. We only have an hour. But the purpose of this is meant to recognize some of the opportunities and important challenges, and we'd like to have it as a discussion. So the format here will be, we'll talk for each of us for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions, and we'll have a dialogue here amongst friends. So with that, Dr. Seyfried?
All right. Thank you very much. How many of us consider ourselves to be self-sufficient? You could pretty much self-sufficient, right? Okay.
I'd like to think so.
Okay. Did you make that tie?
I didn't, Bill.
So somebody else did it for you?
Yes.
Okay, so you're really not completely self-sufficient then?
I've come up short again.
Okay, well. I know for me, I try to do a lot of things for myself if possible. I remember several years ago, I was trying to take care of my lawn, doing the weed in feed, and things were looking good. But I was like, could be a little bit better, a little bit too many weeds. And I knew my lawn was St. Augustine. That's what they told me when we moved in. So I got some weed in feed and put it on there just to make it just good enough. And then the next couple of days, it started to turn brown. And it's like, something's wrong here. So I checked into it, and it was Floratam, not St. Augustine. Yeah, minor difference. They told me a little bit wrong. And the instructions said, do not use on Floratam grass. So it's like, oh well. So I decided, okay, enough. I'm calling Tony Massey. I'm going to let them do my lawn instead. And so they did the weed and feed, and I figured, hey, I'll speak to alumni about globalization and let him do the weed and feed. So no longer self-sufficient. Why do I bring that up? That, in a sense, is the basis for trade. Is we could do a lot of things ourselves, but if we focus on what we do better and then trade with others on what they may be able to do, we both be made better off. I'll have a green lawn instead of a brown lawn. And so, I let somebody else make the clothes, the microphone, and I try to just earn the money and do my thing to help pay for that. And since that's what trade is primarily. Another thing I was thinking about, I have 2 kids who are in middle school right now. When we first started a family, we figured, what type of vehicle did we want to get? What do you think? Minivan. Okay, so we got the minivan. It lasted 10 plus years or so, but it was time to get a new one. And I decided, she decided that we would get another minivan. Okay, but this was going to be an American made. So what type of minivan do you think we got? Honda Odyssey. Yeah. It's something where if you made in America is confusing because it's not, most things are not made in a country. They're made on a planet. So when there was Cars.com does a lot of research on this, and they looked and they found that if you look at what vehicles are 75% of the value added is made in America, the parts are made in America, there's 8 of them that qualify. And I have a student here, I won't call on her, so I'll keep her off the hook. But the Honda Odyssey was number 4 in terms of sales compared to jobs created. So it led to a lot of American jobs created. The Honda Odyssey was number 4 on that list. Number 1 American-made car in terms of American jobs created is the Toyota Camry. In fact, if you look at the top 5, all the top 5 that generate most jobs in the U.S. are Japanese. They're American. It doesn't make sense to say these vehicles are not American or Japanese. Headquarters is one thing, but where it's produced, not assembled, but where different parts of production take place is a critical thing. And there's only 3 with American, there's a Buick, I think there's a Chevrolet, I believe, number 6, 7, and 8 were headquartered in the US, but all the others were Japanese-owned vehicle or headquarters, but American-made. So that's something when we think about trade, it doesn't make sense to think in reality, to think of where the headquarters of the company is, but where it's actually being produced. Another thing to think about when it comes to trade is, do we make anything in this country anymore? How many people think we really don't make anything? We just do service stuff. It's something I hear people say that all the time. We actually are the number 2 manufacturing company in the world. Here's an easy question for you. Who's the number 1 manufacturing country in the world? China's number 1, yes. So China does, in terms of value add, you look at the amount that gets produced, the value of what's being produced. China's number 1, US is number 2. US does more manufacturing in terms of value added than Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico combined. So we do make things. We make more than most other countries out there. So manufacturing is still there. In fact, the record year of manufacturing, the data is not yet official, but preliminary evidence thinks that the record for manufacturing production took place back in 2016. Say, wait a minute, but what about the jobs? What happened to the number of manufacturing jobs? We don't have as much, they're automated. It's something where jobs in manufacturing have declined, but production has increased. So manufacturing is still quite high, a big part of the US economy, but not a big part of the US job market. They're not the same thing. And once again, how do we get that is because we're producing a lot more productivity. The amount that each worker is able to produce has increased a lot because of automation. Automation's increased quite a bit. In fact, Germany has lost 1/4 of their manufacturing jobs. Japan has lost 1/3 of the manufacturing jobs over the last 20, 25 years or so. So this is a global phenomenon that's taking place. Lots of countries are doing it. So the main threat to the American automobile worker is the American robot, as opposed to foreign competition. Yeah, some of the foreign automobile companies that move overseas, but are we seeing any foreign companies come into the US? Yeah, you go to South Carolina, you go to Alabama, you go to Indiana, you're getting an integration of the global economy where foreign companies come here, US companies move overseas. There's a mixture that's taking place. And so we do make a lot of goods and services. In fact, I said manufacturing jobs, we've lost manufacturing jobs through the years. In the last decade, do you think we've gained or lost manufacturing jobs? Gained, you're thinking, he's setting me up. 10 years ago, you go back, the recession began in 2007, so if you take into account the recession and the recovery, yeah, we lost manufacturing jobs. About 1 million less manufacturing jobs than what we had about a decade ago. But when it comes to college-educated workers, we've actually added 400,000 manufacturing jobs for college-educated workers. We lost about 1.4 million for those with high school and less. So the type of jobs is different. Today's manufacturing job is not what we had in the mid-2000s or the 90s or 80s. We've actually have a net increase in manufacturing jobs for more educated workers and less for the traditional that you think of in terms of manufacturing. So education makes a big difference. Global poverty. Global poverty, I've been talking mainly about the US, but global poverty has plummeted over the last several decades. Number of people living in extreme poverty is down by up to 1 billion people globally. A lot of that in China, but also a lot of other countries around the world. So there's been a lot of progress. And once again, part of that is being in the global economy, but part of it, as we'll see in a moment, is not just the system that's out there, but the policies that are put in place underneath that. So you've had a lot of successes going on globally. And once again, things are not perfect there. When the title or the description came out in terms of the discontents, yeah, the globalization causes change to take place. But so does technology. So does just new products in that. There's lots of things going on. Sometimes it's hard to disentangle where that stuff is coming from. But why has globalization increased so much in recent decades, do you think? You got it. Transportation logistics. Yeah, we have treaties out there, But if we got rid of the treaties, globalization would have taken off anyway. Because it's much cheaper to transport goods than it used to be. And information, it's much easier to communicate than it used to be. So the big reason for increased globalization is not different treaties. That's putting a framework around it, but it's cheaper to interact with one another in terms of communication and transportation. So those are some of the big things that have been going on. Given the dislocation, that some of it coming from trade, some jobs lost, some jobs gained, given the automation, a key thing comes down to helping the economy be more dynamic, and in particular, helping individuals be able to adjust to change. And that's probably, I think, one of the biggest struggles we have, trying to help prepare people for change. How many people are doing the same thing, working for the company now that they did when they first got hired 5, 10, 15, 30 years ago? Pretty much the same thing. How many people's jobs have changed radically over the since they got hired? Yeah. So with education, it's like, I was thinking about asking it this way, in terms of, how much did you learn at Crummer that you're directly using now? But I figured, Dawn may not like that question, maybe a little bit too risky. But my hope is that you're not directly using a lot of it necessarily. The key thing we're teaching, hopefully, is the ability to learn and keep up. If we could teach you, hey, how can you be the best manager in 2017? Bad news, 2017 has 8 months left. If you could learn those skills and keep it up in the 2020s and 2030s, then we succeeded. Globalization, technology means we need to keep learning. We need to keep changing. We need to keep adapting. And that's the key thing we need to adjust in terms of the changing world for whatever the cause is. Some people if you have college education, you're doing probably pretty decent right now. Unemployment's under 2.5% for college grads. Salaries, wish they could go up more, they're beginning to go up more, but the big problem is those who have less education are more struggling. And that's where we need, that's the best response to whether it's robots or whether it's trade or anything else. It's doing more to cultivate individuals to help them develop the human capital to be able to adjust to the changing world. That's,
okay.
Turn it back
Thanks,
to Keenan.
Bill. Yeah, thank you, Bill. So I want to give Keith an opportunity to make a few remarks about sustainability, and then we'll talk about all these things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I teach in one of those areas that has a lot of intersection with globalization. And I think we could probably have representatives from all across our faculty who are touched by and touch on in their coursework the area of globalization. Just to seed the field perhaps with some thoughts about that intersection, about what sustainability is and how it intersects with globalization. I jotted down just some ideas to share, and then a couple of stories about where things go well and where things create some challenges, right? So when we think about sustainability, okay, a lot of people initially think, well, what does that mean? Well, my ability to sustain. Okay, we can take it straight from the linguistic perspective, but in what way? And there's some definitions out there that I think are very useful. One that's been around that came out of the United Nations, a commission called the Brundtland Commission back in 1987. It was very basic. The idea was, and I'll quote it here, to meet present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So to be able to do what we do as a society, live the way we live, allow others to live the way we live, but at the same time not compromise the ability to continue doing that in the future. There's some other versions of it that I like. This is one that I like. Do unto future generations as you would have them do unto you. That's cool. And then a real basic one that I like is this one. Enough for all forever. And in a way, it's kind of an extension of what you were saying, Keenan, about how much things tie back into what is 87 years ago, this question of discontent. And we've really just progressed as a society. Technology, logistics have allowed us to interact in a much broader way globally in terms of physical location. Technology, is now allowing us to do it, in real time, face to face, et cetera. So I think we see sustainability as just moving forward along that vein. So I want to share just a couple of thoughts about that are critical to sustainability. One of the key tenets of sustainability is system thinking. So we're looking at how does product design interact with community livelihood halfway around the world? How does it interact with development of streams of waste and how those are going to be treated? So we have to think about the things that we do in a very holistic way. And there's some conditions that were created that sort of in a broad way talk about how we as a society can develop or conduct ourselves, our business, in a way that would be sustainable from the perspective of the planet. Because you can think about Earth having gone on all these many thousands and billions of years as a closed system with just one input, right? Solar energy. Everything else works in cycles. You remember learning about the nitrogen cycle, hydrogen cycle, water cycle, rock cycle, all these things. Everything works in cycles. So this group, The Natural Step, came up with this framework, and they recognized 4 major conditions that we need to avoid if we want to be sustainable. We want to avoid building up substances that are being extracted from the earth. The idea being that Mother Nature buried some of those things away for a good reason, because it doesn't have a way of dealing with them on the surface easily. We want to avoid the buildup of chemicals produced by society. We've gotten very good about creating materials, chemicals to do the things we want to do very efficiently. We've outpaced Mother Nature's ability to deal with those things when they get into our waste streams. So how do we manage that as we continue to develop? We want to not degrade nature's ability to repair itself, to take care of its own cycles, right? Because it's been operating in cycles and will operate in cycles. But how do we not degrade nature's ability to do that? And then how do we also not create conditions that undermine other people's ability to determine their own lifestyle? So those are some of the main ideas around how we want to develop to be sustainable. So I wanted, this idea, as we talked about the intersection with globalization, led me into a couple of thoughts. I want to share with you one sort of scenario maybe, and then 2 stories, kind of talk about how these things intersect in an interesting way. And one is this idea about product supply chains. So when I talk about sustainability, I teach on sustainability in the supply chain, we start out talking about the way business used to work. We used to think about the cradle to gate, right? So the idea was take, make, and sell. And that's where business was primarily focused. So it was about extracting, very often from there, some other place, right? And then consuming here. And a lot of manufacture does extract in other places, and then we have consumption that's very high in affluent parts of the world. And a lot of that extraction was dirty resource extraction. So whether it's mining, including labor. So you can think of labor as a resource, and the dirty extraction of that labor may be poor labor practices that are going on in various places. And we try to advance beyond that. In our thinking, we go beyond cradle to gate and start thinking about cradle to grave. So now we extend our thinking, so we're now really more, though, along the lines of take, make, waste. And then you start thinking about things like landfill issues, about air pollution. And are those global or are those local issues? I don't know. We're consuming here, so then the waste, a lot of it ends up in landfills here. Or does it? We remember years ago there was this question about how much waste we were exporting, right? Barges of waste being shipped around the world. And even if it's not intentional, you get into this question of electronic waste. So where do our old, we're such a consumer-driven society, right? And we have built-in obsolescence in so many of our products. Where does all the electronic products go, right? We don't want them ending up in our landfills because unfortunately we've put a lot of materials in there that we've extracted from, that the planet had hidden away very neatly. They make our tools, our phones, our computers work very efficiently. So we use them, and then what? Nature has no way of disposing of them. So we're fortunately getting better. We're not just dumping in landfills, but at least not here. So we end up doing what? We're exporting those into the developing world, so to India and China and places like that, where people are picking through them and melting down circuit boards to try to get out the gold and other materials that they can sell, which is incredibly hazardous to their health. So how do we deal with that? So those are issues. Things like, anyone heard of the plastic island? That's been something that's been talked about for many years now, right? So we've got plastic waste, a lot of plastic bottles and things like this that end up in our waterways, end up out in the oceans, and currents globally take them out to a couple areas out in the ocean. They found an area apparently close to the size of Texas floating out in the middle of the Pacific. That's something like 3 or 4 meters deep of plastic waste that is just slowly decomposing in the sunlight into toxic sludge, essentially. And what is that doing? Okay, well, that's localized in that little area, except for all of the migratory fish and things like that then end up coming right back into our food stream. So this question is, it's very difficult to think about what we do, how we produce, how we consume in a way that is not already globalized. Again, treaty or not, we're involved in this process of consumption, this cycle. And then the very advanced way now, thinking of supply chains, when you take into account really beyond just the waste end of it, how do I dispose of a product at the end of life, is thinking not just cradle to gate or cradle to grave, but now what people are talking about is cradle to cradle. And the idea that waste equals food. And what does that mean? Well, waste, the end product or the end of life of one product could become a raw material for something else. So how can we design our products so at the end of life they could be not disposed of at all, but become some kind of biological or technical input into some other product? So that's where we're going. And how does that address this question, or how does that tie into this question of globalization? Well, clearly a product will end up in one place, but maybe need to be beginning life anew somewhere else. Okay, so a couple of interesting anecdotes, stories. When I teach my sustainability class, we often start out with this video. It's my shock video, my shock introduction, right? And it's actually a video that was posted. This was 2010, and it's a story. It's set in an office, and this guy's there, and he pulls open this Kit Kat bar and he package it, and he pulls it up, and what he takes out actually is a finger of some animal, and he puts it in his mouth and bites, and there's like blood flying everywhere, and he's just casually going on it. But it was an attack ad from Greenpeace, and it was targeting Nestle, particularly their use of palm oil, that they were contracting with a company in Indonesia who was doing illegal deforestation and ruining the habitat for the orangutan. And this became a very interesting couple of months for Nestle. This was 2010. We're not talking about the 80s, right? Now, what was interesting there was that Nestle at that point in time was using something like 0.7% of the world's market of palm oil. And Nestle is a huge company. They use palm oil in a lot of their products, but they were still a fraction of 1%, okay? But Greenpeace had been trying to get them to change their dealings with this company, and decided to go about it this way. And it got extremely interesting. And if you come back, and we still talk about 3 courses for life, right? So come back and take my class. We'll go into a lot more details. It's actually a very interesting thing about social media management and all kinds of things and PR. But the long and short of it was that the question for them was supply chain visibility, right? Mm-hmm. They were not really aware of the practices, in this case the illegal practices, of one of their global vendors. And this is not an uncommon story. You probably can think of companies who've been, any other companies you can think of who got caught in that sort of issue? Apple, very recently. You can go way back to many. Nike, right? And sweatshop labor and all these kinds of issues, right? So that's one issue of globalization, and this question about people's ability to maintain and have a standard of living, work conditions in their communities and their environments that needs to still be addressed. But we can think about this very, very differently, and I think globalization allows us to think about this differently. So I also teach about I use a TED Talk as a teaching point by a guy named Jason Clay. If you get a chance to look him up, he was a vice president with the World Wildlife Fund. And they were concerned about 35 regions around the world that were the most biodiverse regions, but they were being very significantly threatened due to this dirty extraction of resources and things like that. And they were trying to figure out how do they address these issues. So they realized that these were commodities that were being utilized in consumer products, and they said, okay, we can go about it by trying to get consumers to think about this differently. We have 7 billion consumers speaking something like 6,000 different languages. Market studies show that when people are making a buying decision, like in the supermarket, they'll look at the label. It's something like 6 to 7 seconds is that window in which you have to impact their decision on making that product. How do they reach those 7 billion customers to influence what they're going to do in that 6-point-something seconds in 6,000 different languages? And then they decided to totally rethink the question. Instead of saying, how do we address the choices the consumers make? It's like, how do we think about the choices we put in front of the consumers? And they recognized that those products were, those 35 places that were at risk, it was because of 15 different commodities. And there's some 300 to 500 companies responsible for the global trade in those commodities, or interactions that are taking place between global companies. When they started analyzing it, they realized, wait a minute, it really is just, across those 15 commodities, there's about 100 companies that are doing a major global trade in these products. And they realized, you know, okay, we could go after 7 billion people, or we could figure out how do we interact with 100 global companies. And that's the approach they started to take. And they found that if they were to get 25 of those companies on board, they could get close to, through their supply chains, impacting about 50% of the trade in all 15 of those commodities. Now that takes some significant kind of coordination. And one of the things we talk about in strategy and business strategy is shared value. Right? So Michael Porter, who you will all know from his 5 Forces and so on, more recently, and Mark Kramer started talking about shared value. One of the tenets of shared value is rethinking and enabling global clusters. So we're starting to see companies come together who are huge competitors, but come together to say, how do we make sustainability a pre-competitive issue? How do we get together and create an environment such that consumers now don't have a choice? The product is going to be sustainable. Now we compete on price, we'll compete on features, we'll compete on all these other things. And so that's, I think, a very interesting aspect of globalization that's taking place. And then one last anecdote that's very interesting is to look at some of the maybe unintended consequences of globalization on a local scale. So I mentioned that I take students to Costa Rica frequently, and we go into this little community called Monteverde. And one of the things I always have my students do is go through the cheese factory. Why? Because in the tour of the cheese factory, they told the best history of that community. It's a community that was founded by a group of Quakers from Alabama who went down there because Costa Rica had just abolished the army in the early 50s. And they went down there and said, good, this is where we're going to go. We're against war. We're going to go down there and live. We don't know what we're going to do though to make a living. What are we going to do? They figured out that cheese was the thing they were going to do. They learned how to make cheese. And this became the center of the community, right? So it supported it and created a dairy industry in that community. And they had this cheese factory. It was great. And they were serving an area of the market that was underserved. It was a mid-sized company. Well, okay, many, many years later, Walmart has entered the market in Costa Rica. And they did that in a very interesting way, which I won't get into in the interest of time. Maybe in our Q&A it might come up some. But one of the downsides of this is that Walmart has bought out a number of the chains of grocery stores in the country. And for a small producer like this, the problem that they're facing now, which is really tied to globalization, is that companies want them to have enough product that they can serve not just the market in Costa Rica, but also Nicaragua and Honduras and so on. And for a small company that was in a nice niche area and a nice comfortable size in the market in Costa Rica, they don't see them, Walmart does not see them as a big enough player to meet their regional needs. And as a result of that, they essentially had to sell out to a large Mexican conglomerate. So now this company that was community owned, all the shareholders were these small farmers and so on. They got a decent payout when it was bought, but now they have they're selling their milk to a company that they don't know how committed they are to the community. And if things go bad, are they just going to close and walk away and things like that? So there's that whole question of livelihood that comes in. So just some of the different ways that this idea of sustainability very much intersects with globalization on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, good. Thank you, Keith. I'll say a few. I'm going to kind of cut my remarks short because I want to get the folks here in the room involved. But kind of tying into both of the topics that the two of you talked about, I spent a lot of time thinking about, as an operations professor, this may be strange, but social dislocation and social connectedness. And I don't mean that just about on your iPhone, but I mean deep, connected social connections. And I think about that a lot because I am concerned about our younger generation. I don't consider myself to be a part of that, by the way. But when I see that in the United States, for example, we have the highest unemployment rate of young people since the end of World War II, and I see many of our students, especially those who are under 40, and their passion for philanthropy and their desire to connect with something meaningful, I think that there's something going on. And I sometimes describe this current generation as having what I might call a meaning deficit, meaning they're looking for something to connect to, and they're searching for that, and it's sometimes that searching is seen by older generations. I'm a part of what is called Generation X, so we're kind of the disaffected, post-deindustrialization of the U.S. The town I grew up in, we had 5 factories. By the time I was in high school, we had no factories. So that's kind of the generation I'm with. But I think that they're a little bit misunderstood. And this kind of dislocation, I think, there's a few things that are kind of undercurrents. One is disempowerment, but also inequality. And we know from right now, at least by figures that are put out by the Pew Research Center, that the income inequality in OECD countries is at its highest level for the past half century. So the average income of the richest 10% is about 9 times that of the poorest 10%, up from 7 times from 25 years ago. Real wages in the United States have been declining since 1973 or flat, while at the same time productivity is high. So you have those kinds of dynamics going on. And I think that in some ways to understand this dislocation that's arising from market societies. That means everything's for sale, the market kind of runs our organizations, and we negotiate based upon the price mechanism. We can go back to the 1930s, and we see, and that's why, one of the reasons why we see Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, came up. There were smart people that realized there was something going on here. There was something unsettling in the original German title. They couldn't quite put their hand on it, but they knew that something was wrong. At the same time, the entire field of macroeconomics develops in the 1930s, really modern macroeconomics. John Maynard Keynes, in his book, it comes out at that time. And one of the big differentiating factors with Keynes is he talks about, introduces what I would call a sociological idea, which is animal spirits. So he talked about markets not just in terms of prices, but there were these animal spirits, meaning there were things that were going on that were not quite rational, that were happening. And I think one really great book that I can recommend to folks, a 1944 classic by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation, kind of addresses this. And he saw the 1920s as this period of great stability, relatively speaking, and conservative. Not stability, I should say conservative. A conservative period where everyone was trying to get back on the gold standard, everyone was trying to stabilize their currencies, and it wasn't until the 1930s that you had this reaction against the social dislocation. And the reaction was political, and that's where the isms of fascism, socialism, global communism, to push back against these factors, these market society factors that were dislocating them socially. So I think sometimes in order to understand where we are now, we have to go back before post-war, because the post-war period is really kind of an historical anomaly. That's just not the way things were. So, with this point, when we leave the administration of affairs to markets, we're kind of putting things on autopilot, and we have these, what we would call in economics, externalities, or market failures. And to deal with those market failures and externalities, like people being unemployed by machines, we need institutions. We need government to intervene. We need non-market mechanisms, because the market's just not going to deal with that. So I think that for me, the challenge is how do we engage young people to kind of directly become involved in building up institutions that moderate these dislocation effects and this kind. I mean, I'll just look around this room. How many people live in the town where they were born? Wow. Okay, let's go back to your parents. How many of your parents lived or died in the town where they were born? Yeah, grandparents? Great-grandparents. I mean, almost everyone should be raising their hand. So this kind of, especially for my generation and those younger, that we move around for opportunities. The challenge with people, as opposed to businesses. I mean, for businesses, the chief challenge is to adapt to changes in the environment, which are rapid, sudden, and shocking: new products, new competitors, new technologies, new ways of connectedness that may render an organization's products either obsolete or no longer desirable. Think about the amateur camera market, right? Everyone's camera is now on their phone. Their phone is really more of a camera than a phone. Private publishing, private transportation, and automotive. But for individuals, I would say that the challenges are deeper and more complex. They're deeper and more complex because, unlike business and capital, people aren't as fluid. They don't move around as much. And when they do, they upend those kind of deep social ties, which have consequences which I don't think that we fully understand. So there's all kinds of things that are dislocating people. In some cases, it's economic. In other cases, it's the environment. But we have to recognize that the trouble in Syria began as a drought. Does everyone remember that? That's why it began, as a drought. People were dislocated, they moved into another area. You had tribal-type organizations, religious and ethnic clashes, and so that's how things started spinning. So when you have dislocation, whether it's physical or social, we have things that go on that we don't quite understand. But I think that these types of externalities and these dislocations manifest themselves in things like drug addiction. Things like we have lots and lots of social ties which are very, very weak and shallow. But all the data we know shows us that children who eat dinner with their parents have much lower incidences of arrest, teen pregnancy, all the things that we'll call social ills. So we know that this connectedness is good, but then how are we going to maintain that or strengthen that? And I would argue one way we have to have strong institutions because of that connectedness, but this other thing is, I don't know. These are open questions. Bill and I were talking about this, that the more connected we are, the more we also retreat to our corners. The more access we have to information, the more we just watch our Facebook feed of our narrow band that we're consuming. And so I think that these are some of the challenges, the connectedness, and how do we maintain that or deepen those things? Because we just took a little a survey here, and most of us are disconnected from our deep family ties. Many of the people around us don't know our greatest fears, our favorite colors, our favorite foods. But if you went to a town where you grew up there, everyone had known you throughout your life course, everyone would know this. You're yearning for that place where everyone knows your name, right? So I'll just leave it at that, but this is kind of, that's some of my concerns in terms of globalization and how we fix it. And I think the technological means in ways are there to help us fix it, but they're also the cause. Just as Freud said 87 years ago. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, or critiques, or comments, thoughts. Please, Don. Okay, so and some of it may be just responses, and you can feel free to ask any questions here. I mean, some of them were just, what do you think are some of the promises that regarding globalization that you believe were made either explicitly or implicitly that have been kept or haven't quite been realized? That's a potential question. What do you think have been some of the most significant failures or successes of globalization? But feel free to kind of jump in on any of the things that Keith and Bill and I spoke about. Sir.
I wondered if you could talk about the nationalization spirit of the electorate in both the U.S. and Britain, and now France's election towards the reduction of globalization and more protectionism towards keeping your jobs in the individual countries.
Either you want to.
Yeah, this is where I could start coughing and defer, but
Yeah, right.
no.
We said we were just going to look to the middle, right?
That's right. That's why we have him in the middle.
And I have something, but
Okay.
I want to give others a chance to say something.
Yeah, I think it ties in a lot. We were talking beforehand as well. Is a lot of this, is it economic? Is it cultural? Is it a mixture of the two? But there's a global phenomenon. Austria had an election which was very close in terms of reaction against globalization or what was happening around the world. So this seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, in lots of countries. So it's like, and it happens a lot, kind of like Keenan Yoho was saying. Like in the 1930s, you had big economic issues, a lot of dislocation, And then it was, how do we react to that? And then in the last decade, we've had the worst economic situation since the 1930s, and a lot of countries are still struggling with that. So immediately it's trying to wrestle with the economic problems, why are things like this, or the changes taking place. And so I think some of it is reacting to the sluggishness of what's going on out there. Some of it is cultural in terms of our right or wrong, perceiving that things are changing. People say, are immigrants helpful to us or not, once again, right or wrong. So it's, like you said, it's a global phenomenon in terms of trying to understand and cope with changes taking place in many different ways.
Keith?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd say that if you, again, think about things from a system perspective, as you go through change, and as global society has gone through changes, there's this almost a pendulum effect in a way, as things settle in and dampen into the new normals. And I think you see some of these kinds of reactions to crises as they pop up into the very large global crises. And then people take them in the context, again, as you say, of their own cultural beliefs and cultural norms and so on, and then it can become amplified, can become polarized, can create a lot of distortion in a sense in terms of the economic, social and societal frameworks.
And sir, I want to make sure I understand the precise question. Can you just repeat it one more time?
Yes, what I see is with our election
Yeah.
and the election in UK getting out of the EC, more of a preference from the Trump administration to bring jobs back in to the point of creating tariffs. And now the French election, where it looks like the person that's going to win is the one that believes most in protecting the country so that more jobs are in the country. So what I see it as an offset to that is that it's going to create increasing prices for the world, and that increase the real benefits of globalization. And so I'm really addressing that issue, and what do you see the long-term impacts on that? Or what I've heard so far is it's just a cycle in the way people think about their social aspects right now, but I'm not so certain that it's not a continuing issue that's going to get worse, and I really don't know how we're going to solve it.
My biggest concern with it is that it increases the potential for conflict. And this is why I think that at the same time there's a lot of criticism about, elites. These are just categories that are thrown out there, and inequality. There's also criticism of these global institutions like the UN or regional or alliance institutions like NATO. And I see those institutions as being even more important, interestingly, during this time, because it's highly desirable to have conflict normalized. And what I mean by normalized conflict is I mean political conflict. Because the alternative to political conflict is armed military conflict. And that is something that in a post-nuclear age is highly undesirable. And so I think that it's even more important now that we have these institutions where we can normalize the conflicts politically. And I'm not necessarily saying that will bring people out of their corners, but when people do come out of their corners, we're playing by Marquis de Queensberry rules rather than no holds barred. And so that's the real, I think, for me, that's why these commitment to these institutions is important, and the legitimacy of them. Whether you think that they work or not, or they're inefficient, that's beside the point. What you have to really focus on is what is the alternative. And if the alternative is armed conflict, that's something that most of our generation, most of the people here in this room have not seen. Our parents and our great-grandparents have seen that on a large scale, but we haven't. So
I want to jump in a little bit more. It's because there are real issues, the increasing inequality, that the urban areas are doing very well in the U.S. economy the last 5 to 10 years. The more rural areas are struggling a lot more, and you get things in between. So there's real issues in terms of inequality, in terms of educational differences, and the rewards to that. So if you don't come up with solutions to try to address those things, people look to say, who's at fault? So you have to deal with the issues. So we could say, hey, I think globalization is a good thing, okay, but the real issue is, why are some people being left behind? And if you deal with some of those issues, I think that could mitigate some of the other negative potential problems.
Yeah, 'cause just as the comment, because the knee-jerk reaction is essentially to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? And look at all of the constructs that are, the good parts of some of the relationships and alliances that we have, but not, sacrifice all of those rather than trying to address the challenges to improve it.
Sir.
Western consumers currently enjoy exporting a great deal of their pollution from the production of their goods to developing countries. How can we go about persuading these Western consumers to accept more of the cost of this pollution, and given the current anti-globalization sentiment that we're seeing across the United States and Europe?
Yeah, it's a reality. It ties very much into the previous question, because I think when you talk about what you're describing is a negative externality, right, as you're referring to, and you have to have policies in place to address those, to address those imbalances, and those kinds of things are going to be addressed through the kinds of organizations that were perhaps now under threat, right? So the trade organizations, the treaty organizations, the United Nations, frameworks, and things like that. So that's where the challenge is coming in, right? How to fix that current problem, I think, is what we're grappling with right now. So how do you, other than strengthen those institutions and try to strengthen their credibility in this increasingly polarized global discussion, it's difficult to come up with a way to say, okay, how do we not exacerbate the problem, and instead try to address and correct those imbalances.
Bill, do you have any?
I was going to say, I think in the industrial age, we've never really paid the true cost of our consumption. And so I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to get. I think that will be much easier to solve than, because you can assign, except for some of the gases and the liquid waste, but like the physical waste will be an easier thing to solve than some of these other unseen, forces and animal spirits that are happening. But until you get those countries that are, generating that, and again, I mean, interestingly, some of the biggest producers of those it's moving to China. So in terms of just numbers of people and the potential for waste, but before we get there, because I don't want to just kick the can, you have to you have to convince consumers in the United States to pay that total cost of consumption, and I don't know what that is. So that's unsatisfying.
Yeah, let me touch on a little bit from an economic point of view. We've tossed around the word externalities, and basically that means, hey, when it comes to producing goods, there's some cost which firms feel, the cost of paying for the lights, the wages, et cetera, but there's some cost of production that firms may not feel, that may be external to them. And the markets fail. They don't work well when there's lots of external costs that firms don't face. And so there's a reason to try to make them feel the cost. And the person who came up with that concept was Adam Smith in 1776, the father of capitalism. So it's a capitalist perspective. A market perspective is that these costs should be made tangible. It's not a liberal or whatever. This is the person who began the first thoughts in terms of capitalism, or the market economy.
Right.
And I said post-industrial only because pre-industrial, they consumed almost everything. There was very little relative waste.
Hi, Ritu from EA 16, Suite 16. My question is pretty much about supply chain, global supply chain. Dr. Seyfried, you said that you want to make sure that we got an education here at Rollins that will prepare us for even 2020. And what's happening a lot is they're talking about blockchaining and a universal currency, Bitcoin. So I wanted to know, are you going to have any lectures that will prepare us for 2020 when blockchaining in the supply chain world and a global currency will potentially take over?
I'll let you do the supply chain.
And when you say prepare, what's the anxiety about it?
Well, it's just a transition. Current global supply chain, you're dealing with treaties, you're dealing with importing, either raw materials or partially processed materials, and then creating a finished good here in North America, and there's taxes and treaties on a lot of those things. But the talk about sort of creating a global currency through Bitcoin and also having the blockchain and the transparency in the supply chain impact the value of the cost of these things in the supply chain. How do you feel it's going to be in 2020, and how can we best prepare? I
guess I would just say that it's an inevitability in my mind, because markets want to go faster, and they want less friction. And so what markets want, markets tend to get. So I think that that's an inevitability. I see blockchaining as more of an accounting system than a currency per se. And I think that perhaps there are some concerns. I mean, there will always be the sovereignty concerns, but I mean, how much sovereignty do you have over your currency right now? I mean, it's in the way that we're interconnected. So the countries were worried about these sovereignty issues and the value of their currency in the 1920s. That's why they were all trying to get on the gold standard, and then there were lots of things that happened afterward. But I think some of the opportunities are anti-corruption. I mean, we have lots of dictators and autocrats around the world that are just sucking the wealth out of their own countries and buying up New York, Paris, and London real estate. You have the North Koreans printing counterfeit $100 U.S. bills. So I think that there is a potential with blockchaining to undercut some of the corruption and some of the black market aspects. Interestingly enough, which market is out front and using blockchains right now? The illicit market. So they're ahead. So yeah, I think it's an inevitability. I don't know in terms of preparation, unless you're prepping for some type of apocalyptic event and you're hoarding gold or something, you think that'll help you post the event. I think that this is just going to be an inevitability in the same way that you don't carry cash in your pocket anymore, you just carry plastic cards.
Yeah. And if you talk about universal currency in terms of euros expand, dollars expand, the pressures seem to be the opposite direction right now. But in terms of just more of accounting features or electronic, that's one thing. But I think that there's pressure actually, the United Kingdom pulling out of the European Union, France having a big controversial election tomorrow. The pressure seems to be more the other direction in terms of just pure currency issues. But once again, accounting is separate.
Yeah. Sir? You had your hand up.
I had a question about, we're talking about globalization, and there are all these countries that have now are involved in globalization. You mentioned China, and all these countries aspire to have the same level of wealth as Western countries, and our Western economies have developed a certain way, and that system, you mentioned it, Adam Smith and the capitalist system, but that model of development that Western countries use to create that wealth, can these countries such as China and others who are coming along now and who want to achieve that kind of wealth, would that same model, should they follow that same model? Is that model sustainable in terms of resources, globally?
Yeah, either of you want to?
It's not. I mean, the answer is it certainly is not sustainable, right? The argument from that. Right, sure, yeah, and this is a real issue. It's been one of the issues in climate change negotiations for the last couple of decades and so on, because exactly as you said, right? So how do you then preclude countries that want to develop from using the same model that the Western world has showed is successful, right? But and the challenge is this, right? The idea is what? Population times consumption equals how much resources you need. And that Jason Clay TED Talk I was referring to today, he argues that we're probably at the moment consuming 1.5 times the resources we have available to us in that mathematical equation. So some of the frameworks that are in place or are useful are the things that have come into play to help make some of the more recent climate change negotiations more palatable. Where, for example, they've created frameworks where countries could help developing countries, or more developed countries could help less developed countries and get credits for that. So they're trying to create frameworks to say, well, okay, we need to change the way development is done, but how can we, mitigate the unfairness of that to countries that are still in the developing process? So they've tried to build into some of these frameworks methodologies where that can create some of that, some balance in that process. So I think some of those kinds of, looking at creative ways to address that issue is really where we're gonna have to go.
The model like Adam Smith, describing this looks, is that model, can that be used now for all these countries?
But,
That's what you get.
Yeah.
The West say, hey, we want to, go into develop, and you are precluding us from using the same methods, whatever.
Well, I think it has to be done with controls. I mean, you might argue that there are parts of Adam Smith's theory that never were implemented, right? This whole idea about trying to manage those externalities, et cetera. So I think it's a matter of doing it, coming up with how to do development right. And maybe even though you could say the way the West should have done it. But I don't think it precludes those economic theories from working. It's just a matter of trying to find ways to do it the right way.
Yeah, there's not a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. There's principles. So like South Korea and China have both experienced incredible economic growth. South Korea since 1960, China since 1979, but they didn't do it the same way. But they had maybe loosely the same framework, but came at it from different angles. So there's not a recipe, there's concepts. And within those concepts, there's different ways of accomplishing that same goal. So doing it in the 21st century within that framework could be different than 1800s, 1900s.
So, and I would say that I think that we're already seeing it. I think they're already doing it. I think they have, they're pursuing national economies in some sense. If you look at the energy industry, so let's just look at the raw inputs and the things that's most important to any country. They have to have energy other than water. They need energy. And all of these countries, the United States is unique in that we have no nationalized oil companies. We are unique. We have no national oil companies. Everyone else does. They see that as too important to leave to the market mechanism. So in those countries, when you look at the Pacific, for example, and refined petroleum products, I mean, one of the biggest countries for refined petroleum in the region is South Korea. They have some of the largest refinery plants. China is building a lot, and they're not building according to market rules. They're building according to what I would call strategic rules. Remember when the United States sent Commodore Perry to the shores of Japan, that was not an invitation to trade. That was an ultimatum, you will trade. The Chinese haven't, they have a long view of history, and so they are building the refinery capacity well above their actual national demand. They're building strategic reserves, and they're also building strategic reserves of just raw petroleum. And so you see countries like China, Vietnam, South Korea, and Japan, they're managing those things on a national basis to look at longer-term goals, India as well. And I think that that's Vietnam. That's what we'll see. That doesn't mean they don't trade with anyone else. A lot of the refineries that are going into Vietnam, for example, are joint ventures. They're joint ventures where they will have sole source supplies from Saudi Aramco or Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, for example. So you're shipping raw crude from the Arabian Gulf into Vietnam, and then Vietnam pays with its national funds for the infrastructure for the refining capacity. So they have that kind of strategic relationship as well. Japan is actually drawing down its refinery capacity, but it's building refineries in Vietnam for the sole purpose, well, primarily to export to Australia. because I did make a mistake. Australia is one of the only other countries that they have no national oil company, and Australia will have no refining capacity by their own estimates by 2030. So they'll be completely dependent. They already depend upon Singapore for 75 to 80% of their oil, petroleum products. So I think that we'll see this kind of this national approach to protect, but you know, the market, this kind of market type mechanisms has worked out for China. It's just at the limit, where does it go? And again, at the limit for me, I'm concerned about minimizing conflict. And so I'll leave it. That's more than you wanted to hear, probably. So I'm looking at the clock and I'm looking at Dawn.
We are over time.
And I wish I could sit here and talk to you for another 45 minutes to an hour.
Doesn't this make you want to go back to class? I
But
didn't get to have any of these faculty members when I was in the program, and I want to go take classes. Dr. Seyfried mentioned Classes for Life. We should all go.
So I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Seyfried and Dr. Whittingham. I'd like to thank Dawn for the opportunity to come and meet all of you and talk, and we'll be here afterward. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your commitment to the school, your ongoing commitment to the school. It means a lot. It means a lot to me to come here as being a new person to meet you, and I appreciate it.
If you have not met Dr. Yoho, we're celebrating 2 retirements as part of our alumni weekend, both Dr. Singleton and Dr. Serto. And obviously I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Whittingham and Dr. Seyfried for a number of years now, but it's people like Dr. Yoho, and I see Dr. Simsak here as well. These are our new faculty members that have just joined the family within the last couple of years, and they really have such phenomenal expertise and backgrounds that I encourage all of you to get to know them. I also wanted to recognize we have one of the members. There are 22 members of our Crummer Alumni Hall of Fame. One of them is with us today. He's a trustee, Jack Myers, in the back here. Thank you for being with us, Jack.
Thank you for your question.
And of course, Dr. Matulich, who is one of our emeritus faculty members. So thank you all for being here. We have more events today, so we look forward to seeing you. But thank you again to our panel.
Thanks. Okay.